Chapter 1, Science and Pseudoscience in Clinical Psychology, Initial Thoughts, Reflections, and Considerations, by Scott O. Lilienfeld, Stephen J. Lynn, and Jeffrey M. Lohr. In many ways, the sprawling terrain of clinical psychology and allied disciplines, psychiatry, social work, counseling, school psychology, psychiatric nursing, houses two largely disconnected worlds. One world consists of researchers and practitioners who ground their work largely in scientific evidence. Investigators in this first world adhere to scientific methods in their research, availing themselves of these methods as crucial safeguards against biases in their inferences. Practitioners in this first world actively consume research findings and base their interventions and diagnostic methods largely on the best available published findings. The other world, which is largely unknown to many academics ensconced comfortably in their ivory tower, consists of mental health professionals who routinely neglect research evidence. Many professionals in this second world are not regular consumers of scientific finding, and they commonly administer therapeutic and assessment methods that are either unsupported or inadequately tested. Indeed, over the past several decades, clinical psychology and related disciplines have witnessed a change in the relation between science and practice. A growing minority of clinicians appear to be basing their therapeutic and assessment practices primarily on clinical experience and subjective intuition, rather than on controlled research evidence. As a consequence, the term scientist-practitioner gap is being invoked with increasing frequency, and concerns that the scientific foundations of clinical psychology are steadily eroding continue to be voiced in many quarters. Fueling these worries are surveys of clinical psychologists and other mental health professionals, which reveal that large percentages of them are skeptical of the need for evidence-based practice. Many report that they place considerably more weight on their clinical experience, intuition, and theoretical orientation than on controlled research evidence when selecting intervention. As the history of medicine teaches us, this devaluation of scientific evidence is likely to have deleterious consequences for our clients. It is largely these concerns that have prompted us to compile this edited volume, which features chapters by distinguished experts across a broad spectrum of areas within clinical psychology. Given the markedly changing landscape of clinical psychology, we believe the second edition of this book to be both timely and important. Much has changed since the publication of the first edition of this volume over a decade ago. These changes make a revised edition imperative. On the one hand, there are some grounds for optimism. In the years following the appearance of the first edition, the field of clinical psychology has seen a heightened focus on evidence-based practice, accompanied by a movement to identify empirically supported therapies for specific psychological conditions. On the other hand, there are ample reasons for continuing concern. As the chapters to follow make clear, many or most domains of clinical practice continue to be plagued by the widespread use of questionable or unvalidated techniques. In this book's second edition, we have not only updated our previous chapters in light of recent research, but added two new chapters focused on clinical domains that have become a focus of increasing concern over the past decade: attachment therapies and questionable treatments for childhood and adolescent antisocial behaviors. As a consequence of these updates and additions, this volume remains the most comprehensive resource for practitioners, researchers, instructors, and students who wish to distinguish well-supported from poorly supported techniques in clinical psychology and related fields. Some might contend that the problem of unsubstantiated treatment techniques is not new and has in fact dogged the field of clinical psychology virtually since its inception. To a substantial extent, they would be correct. Nevertheless, the growing availability of information resources, some of which have also become misinformation resources, including popular psychology books and the internet, the apparent upsurge of training programs that do not emphasize scientific training, and the burgeoning industry of fringe psychotherapy have magnified the gulf between scientist and practitioner to a problem of serious proportion. The scientist-practitioner gap and its sources. What are the primary sources of the growing scientist-practitioner gap? As many authors have noted, some practitioners in clinical psychology and related mental health disciplines continue to use unsubstantiated, untested, and otherwise questionable treatment and assessment methods. Moreover, psychotherapeutic methods of unknown or doubtful validity are proliferating on an almost weekly basis. For example, one highly selective sampling of fringe psychotherapeutic practices included neurolinguistic programming, thought field therapy, emotional freedom technique, rage reduction therapy, primal scream therapy, feeling therapy, Buddha psychotherapy, past lives therapy, future lives therapy, alien abduction therapy, angel therapy, rebirthing, Sedona method, Silva method, entity depossession therapy, vegetotherapy, palm therapy, and a plethora of other methods. Furthermore, a great deal of academic and media coverage of such fringe treatments is accompanied by scant critical evaluation. One edited volume features 23 chapters on largely unsubstantiated psychological techniques, including music therapy, homeopathy, breath work, therapeutic touch, aromatherapy, medical intuition, acupuncture, and body-centered psychotherapy. Nevertheless, in most chapters, these techniques receive minimal scientific scrutiny. More recently, consumers can purchase volumes on energy therapy, body work therapy, brain-based psychotherapy, among scores of others that are largely or entirely devoid of empirical support. Additional threats to the scientific foundation of clinical psychology and allied fields stem from the thriving self-help industry. This industry produces hundreds of books, manuals, and audio books, many of which promise rapid or straightforward solutions to complex problems. Although some of these self-help materials may be efficacious, the overwhelming majority of them have never been subjected to empirical scrutiny. In addition, an ever-increasing self-help programs on television and radio talk shows routinely offer advice of questionable scientific validity to a receptive but often vulnerable audience. Similarly, questionable practices can be found in the domain of psychological assessment and diagnosis. Despite well-replicated evidence that statistical actuarial formulas are superior to clinical judgment for a broad range of judgmental and predictive tasks, most clinicians continue to rely on clinical judgment, even in cases which it has been shown to be ill-advised. There is also evidence that many practitioners tend to be overconfident in judgments and predictions, and to fall prey to basic errors in reasoning, that is, confirmation bias, illusory correlation, hindsight bias, in the process of case formulation. Moreover, many practitioners base their interpretations on assessment instruments, for example, human figure drawing test, Rorschach ink blot test, Myers-Briggs type indicator, anatomically scaled balls, that are either highly controversial or questionable from scientific. Still, other clinicians render confident diagnoses of psychiatric conditions such as dissociative identity disorder, known formally as multiple personality disorder, whose validity remains in dispute. The problem of questionable diagnostic labels is especially acute in courtroom settings, where psychiatric labels of unknown or doubtful validity, such as road rage syndrome, sexual addiction, battered woman syndrome, are sometimes invoked as exculpatory defenses. Striking a balance between excessive open-mindedness and excessive skepticism. Still, we should avoid the temptation to be dismissive. At least some of the largely or entirely untested psychotherapeutic assessment and diagnostic methods reviewed in this volume may ultimately prove to be efficacious or valid. It would be a serious error to refuse to consider any untested techniques out of hand or antecedent to prior critical scrutiny. In fairness, such closed-mindedness has sometimes characterized debates concerning the efficacy of novel psychotherapies. Nevertheless, a basic tenet of science is that the burden of proof falls squarely on the claimant, not the critic. As a consequence, it is up to the proponents of these techniques to demonstrate that they work, not up to the critics of these techniques to demonstrate the converse. As Carl Sagan eloquently pointed out, scientific inquiry demands a unique mix of open-mindedness and penetrating skepticism. We must remain open to novel and untested claims, regardless of how superficially implausible they might appear at first blush. At the same time, we must subject these claims to incisive scrutiny to ensure that they withstand the crucible of rigorous scientific testing. As space scientist James Oberg observed, keeping an open mind is a virtue, but this mind cannot be so open that one's brains fall out. Although the requirement to hold all claims to high levels of skeptical scrutiny applies to all domains of science, such scrutiny is especially crucial in applied areas such as clinical psychology, in which erroneous claims or ineffective practices have the potential to produce. Why potentially pseudoscientific techniques? Some might respond to our arguments by contending that although many of the techniques reviewed in this book are either untested or ineffective, most are likely to prove either efficacious or ineffective. From this perspective, our emphasis on the dangers posed by such techniques is misplaced because unresearched practices are at worst inert. Nevertheless, this counterargument overlooks several important considerations. Specifically, there are at least three major ways that unsubstantiated mental health techniques can be problematic. First, some of these techniques may be harmful. The tragic case of Candace Mayweather, a 10-year-old who was smothered to death in 2000 by therapists practicing a variant of attests to the dangers of untested therapeutic techniques. There is also increasing reason to suspect that certain suggestive techniques for unearthing reportedly repressed memories of trauma may exacerbate or even reduce psychopathology by inadvertently implanting false memories of past events. Even the use of facilitated communication for infantile autism has resulted in numerous erroneous accusations of child abuse against psychopaths. There is accumulating evidence that certain widely used treatment techniques such as critical incident stress debriefing, scared straight programs for delinquency, and perhaps certain self-help programs can be harmful for some clients. Consequently, the oft-held assumption that, quote, doing something is always better than doing nothing, unquote, in the domain of psychotherapy is likely to be mistaken. As psychologist Richard Gist reminds us, doing something is not licensed to do anything. Second, even psychotherapies that are by themselves innocuous can indirectly produce harm by depriving individuals of scarce time, financial resources, or both. Economists refer to this side effect as opportunity cost. As a result of opportunity cost, individuals who would have otherwise used their time and money to seek out demonstrably efficacious treatments may be left with precious little of either. Such individuals may therefore be less likely to obtain interventions that could prove beneficial. Third, the use of unsubstantiated techniques eats away at the scientific foundations of the profession of clinical psychology. As one of us observed, quote, once we abdicate our responsibility to uphold high scientific standards in administering treatments, our scientific credibility and influence are badly damaged. Moreover, by continuing to ignore the imminent dangers posed by questionable mental health techniques, we send an implicit message to our students that we are not deeply committed to anchoring our discipline in scientific evidence or to combating potentially unscientific practices. Our students will most likely follow in our footsteps and continue to turn a blind eye to the widening gap between scientist and practitioner and between research evidence and clinical work. End quote. In addition, the promulgation of treatment and assessment techniques of questionable validity can undermine the general public's faith in the profession of clinical psychology and lead citizens to place less trust in the assertions of clinical researchers and practitioners.